Narrator. When the United States and Venezuela collide, the shock waves are not confined to the Americas. Thousands of kilometers away in Moscow, policymakers, energy strategists, and military planners are watching very closely. Because the confrontation between Washington and Caracas is not only about regime change, sanctions, or oil. It is also about Russia's global influence, its credibility as an ally, and its ability to challenge U.S. dominance beyond Europe. Today, we examine one key question. To what extent does the U.S.-Venezuela crisis affect Russia economically, strategically, and geopolitically? Part 1. Why Venezuela matters to Russia. For Russia, Venezuela is far more than a distant partner. It represents three critical interests. First, symbolic power. Venezuela has long been Russia's strongest ally in the Western Hemisphere, a visible reminder that U.S. influence is not absolute in its own backyard. Second, economic leverage, especially in energy. Russia, through state-controlled companies, invested billions of dollars in Venezuelan oil projects, heavy crude refining, fuel supply, and debt restructuring. Third, military and political alignment. Moscow supplied Venezuela with air defense systems, aircraft, small arms, training, and intelligence cooperation. In simple terms, Venezuela allowed Russia to say, "We can operate globally. We can support allies under U.S. pressure. We are not isolated." But this position is fragile, and the U.S. intervention directly tests it. Part 2. The U.S. move, a strategic setback for Moscow. When the United States escalated pressure on Venezuela through sanctions, covert operations, and eventually direct military action, Russia faced a hard reality. Moscow condemned the action strongly. Russian officials called it a violation of international law, an assault on sovereignty, and proof of U.S. unilateralism. But beyond rhetoric, Russia had very limited options. There was no Russian military intervention, no direct confrontation, no meaningful deterrence. This sent a powerful message, not just to Venezuela, but to Russia's other partners worldwide. If Russia cannot protect a major ally in Latin America, how reliable is it elsewhere? This moment exposed a gap between Russia's global ambitions and its actual capacity to project power so far from home. Part 3. Damage to Russia's image as a global power. One of the most significant impacts is reputational. Russia has spent years positioning itself as a defender of sovereignty, an alternative to Western dominance, and a protector of regimes under U.S. pressure. But in Venezuela, Russia could not prevent the collapse of its allies' control. This weakens Moscow's credibility. Countries watching closely include governments in Africa, Middle Eastern partners, and smaller states balancing between great powers. The lesson they may draw is uncomfortable. Russia can offer weapons, loans, and diplomatic support, but not guaranteed protection against U.S. force. This reputational cost may be more damaging than any immediate financial loss. Part 4. Economic losses and stranded investments. Russia's exposure in Venezuela is not theoretical. It is financial. Over the years, Russian companies invested heavily in oil extraction and refining. Moscow extended loans, often repaid in oil. Arms contracts were signed, but not always fully paid. If a U.S.-aligned government gains long-term control in Caracas, many of these agreements may be frozen, rewritten, or canceled. That means billions of dollars potentially written off, lost future revenue, and reduced access to Venezuelan oil reserves at a time when Russia already faces sanctions and war-related expenses. This compounds economic pressure. Even if losses are manageable, they add to the cumulative strain on the Russian economy. Part 5. Oil, energy, and global markets. Energy is where the impact becomes global. Russia and Venezuela are both major oil producers. Both rely heavily on oil revenue. If U.S. influence leads to increased Venezuelan oil production, reintegration into Western markets, and reduced sanctions, global oil supply could rise. More supply often means lower prices. For Russia, lower oil prices mean reduced government revenue, pressure on the national budget, and weaker economic resilience under sanctions. In this sense, Venezuela becomes a silent pressure point against Moscow, not through direct confrontation, but through market dynamics. Part 6. Strategic distraction or strategic warning. Some analysts argue that Russia made a calculated choice. With its military and political focus absorbed by Ukraine and Eastern Europe, Moscow may have decided Venezuela was not worth escalation. If true, this suggests a shift in Russian strategy. Prioritize nearby theaters, accept losses in distant regions, conserve resources. But this strategy comes with risks. Allowing the U.S. to reassert dominance in Latin America may embolden Washington elsewhere. It reinforces the perception that Russia's reach is shrinking, its influence is regional rather than global. Part 7. Diplomacy, narratives, and information. Warfare. Unable to respond militarily, Russia turns to its strongest remaining tools: diplomacy, messaging, and information warfare. At the United Nations, Russia accuses the U.S. of double standards. In global media, Russian narratives frame the crisis as neo-imperialism, economic exploitation, and lawless intervention. This approach aims to undermine U.S. legitimacy, appeal to Global South audiences, and maintain ideological relevance. But narratives alone cannot replace lost influence on the ground. Part 8. Long-term consequences for Russia. Looking ahead, the US-Venezuela crisis leaves Russia facing reduced leverage in Latin America, financial losses in energy and arms sectors, a weakened image as a protector of allies, greater dependence on China as a strategic counterweight. At the same time, Russia may adapt by doubling down on regions where it retains dominance, strengthening ties with non-Western blocs, and recalibrating global ambitions. The crisis becomes a lesson, one that reshapes how Moscow defines power in a multipolar world. Conclusion. The confrontation between the United States and Venezuela is not just a regional story. For Russia, it is a mirror, a reflection of ambition versus capacity, influence versus reality, and rhetoric versus power. The true impact is not a single loss, but a gradual shift in how the world perceives Russia's role. In modern geopolitics, sometimes the most decisive battles are not fought with weapons, but with credibility. And in Venezuela, Russia's credibility was tested.